The dashboard clock glowed 11:42 p.m. Soft blue digits cast a faint light across the interior of the Mercedes-Benz E-Class as it cut through the Mississippi darkness. Outside the windows there was nothing. No street lights, no passing headlights, no houses, no gas stations, no signs of civilization at all. Just Route 119, a ribbon of cracked asphalt threading through dense walls of towering pine trees that rose on either side like silent sentinels guarding secrets the county preferred to keep buried. The night air was thick and heavy, saturated with the humid weight of late July in the deep south. The kind of heat that lingered even after midnight, pressing against the car's air-conditioned cocoon like something alive and hungry. Somewhere in the darkness, cicadas screamed their eternal chorus. But inside the Mercedes, there was only the whisper of cool air through the vents and the low mellow notes of a jazz saxophone drifting from the premium speakers. It was by all appearances a peaceful scene. A luxury sedan carrying what looked like a successful couple returning from a late business dinner. The kind of image that should have been unremarkable, the kind of moment that should have passed without incident. But this was Grayson County, and in Grayson County certain images didn't pass unremarked. Certain people didn't pass through unmolested. Certain cars driven by certain faces attracted attention that no amount of success could deflect. The man behind the wheel sat with his hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2 on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. His posture was relaxed but alert, the posture of someone who had learned to appear calm while remaining ready for anything. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the kind of suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent. His tie was loosened around his collar in a gesture that suggested casual exhaustion after a long day of meetings. Everything about him projected the image of a corporate professional winding down from business obligations. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Not nervously, not anxiously, methodically. He was watching, waiting, expecting something that the woman beside him couldn't quite identify. She sat in the passenger seat with her head resting against the cool leather, her eyes half closed in apparent exhaustion. She was beautiful in an understated way, her natural hair pulled back from her face, her designer dress suggesting the same corporate success as her companion's suit. A handbag that cost more than some cars sat in the footwell at her feet, and a simple diamond tennis bracelet caught the dashboard light when she shifted her arm. They looked in every measurable way like exactly what their identification claimed them to be. A successful couple. Consultants according to the business cards in his wallet. Heading back to their hotel after dinner with clients. Nothing remarkable, nothing suspicious, nothing worth a second glance. And yet, the man's eyes returned to the rearview mirror for perhaps the 20th time in the past 5 minutes. This time something changed in his expression, a subtle tightening around his jaw, a slight narrowing of his focus. He'd seen something in that mirror that he'd been waiting to see. In the distance, barely visible in the complete darkness of the unlit highway, a pair of headlights had flared to life. They'd been sitting there in the shadows, parked in what must have been the entrance to an abandoned gas station, or perhaps just a turnoff in the trees invisible until they chose to announce themselves. Now those headlights swung onto the highway, and within seconds they were rushing up behind the Mercedes, with aggressive speed, closing the distance so fast that the gap between the two vehicles evaporated in a matter of heartbeats. The headlights filled the rearview mirror. Blinding and aggressive, riding the Mercedes bumper so closely that the driver couldn't even see the grille of the pursuing vehicle anymore. Just those lights consuming everything, demanding attention and compliance. And then the night exploded. Red and blue strobes burst to life with violent intensity, their alternating flashes painting the pine trees in harsh, bloody color. The shriek of a police siren shattered the jazz music and the quiet hum of the engine and the distant cicada chorus all at once. A sound designed not to alert, but to intimidate, to dominate, to remind anyone in its radius exactly who held power on these dark country roads. The woman's eyes snapped open. Whatever exhaustion had been real in her posture disappeared instantly, replaced by a tension that ran through her entire body. The man showed no such reaction. His hands remained steady on the wheel. His breathing didn't change. His heart rate, if anyone had been monitoring, it would have read a steady 60 beats per minute. The resting pulse of an athlete. Or a man who had trained himself to remain calm under circumstances far more dangerous than flashing lights. He engaged his turn signal, a small gesture of compliance that documented for any recording his immediate cooperation. Slowly, smoothly, he pulled the heavy luxury sedan onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The tires crunched against loose stone as the car rolled to a stop. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, and placed his hands back on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. "Here we go," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman beside him nodded once, a tight, controlled movement. She reached up toward the rearview mirror and her fingers found something small, something hidden, something that glinted briefly in the reflected strobe lights before she tapped it twice. Whatever that device was, it was now active, recording, watching, waiting. Behind them, the doors of the police cruiser swung open and two figures stepped out into the swirling red and blue chaos. The hunt had begun, but the hunters had made a terrible mistake. They just didn't know it yet. Marcus Webb had learned at a very young age that the world was not fair. He'd learned it in the foster homes of Baltimore, shuttled from one temporary family to another throughout his childhood, never staying long enough to call any place home. He'd learned it in the group homes where the older kids took what they wanted, and the younger ones learned to survive or suffered the consequences. He'd learned it in the underfunded schools where teachers looked at kids like him and saw statistics, saw future inmates, saw problems to be managed, rather than minds to be nurtured. He'd aged out of the foster system at 18 with nothing but a GED, a duffel bag of second-hand clothes, and a burning determination to prove every assumption wrong. The Marines had given him structure when he desperately needed it. They'd given him purpose when he'd been drifting toward destruction. They'd taken an angry young man with nothing to lose and transformed him into something focused, something disciplined, something dangerous in all the right ways. 2 combat tours in Afghanistan had tested that transformation. The Bronze Star hanging in a frame in his home office proved he'd passed those tests. But the Marines had also given him something else. Something he hadn't expected. They'd given him a front row seat to corruption. He'd watched superior officers skim supplies meant for local villages. He'd seen contractors bill the government for phantom services. He'd witnessed the small betrayals and large crimes that flourished wherever power existed without accountability. And he'd learned that the uniform didn't make the man. The badge didn't guarantee the character. Authority unchecked became its own form of tyranny. After his honorable discharge, he'd put himself through college on the GI Bill studying criminal justice with the intensity of someone who'd seen justice fail too many times. The FBI had recruited him at 28, recognizing in his file something they prized. A man who understood both sides of the line, who had grown up in circumstances that bred criminals and emerged determined to catch them instead. He'd spent the next 15 years becoming one of the Bureau's most effective agents in the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Unit. Chicago had been his first major case, dismantling a network of dirty aldermen who'd been selling city contracts for decades. Miami had followed, where he'd taken down a narcotics squad that had been robbing drug dealers and keeping the product for resale. Detroit had been personally exposing a department that had been planting evidence on black teenagers to pad their conviction rates. Each case had taught him something. Each corrupt official he'd brought down had revealed another layer of the rot that infected institutions meant to protect the public. And each victory had reinforced his fundamental belief. The law had to apply to everyone, or it meant nothing at all. But none of those cases had prepared him for the phone call 18 months ago. His sister Keisha had called him at 2 a.m, sobbing so hard he could barely understand her words. She'd been driving through Mississippi, returning from a friend's wedding in New Orleans, taking a shortcut through Grayson County because her GPS had promised it would save her 45 minutes. She'd been pulled over on Route 119 by a deputy who said her taillight was out. It wasn't. She'd had the car inspected 3 days earlier, and the mechanic's report proved every light was functioning perfectly. But that hadn't mattered. The deputy had ordered her out of the vehicle. He'd searched her car without consent, without probable cause, without anything resembling legal justification. He'd found $600 in cash that she'd been planning to deposit in her bank account when she got home. He'd accused her of transporting drug money. He'd seized the cash under civil asset forfeiture laws. He'd impounded her vehicle, leaving her stranded on the side of a dark highway in a county where she knew no one. She'd had to call a friend to drive 4 hours to pick her up. The impound fees to retrieve her car had cost her another $800. When she tried to get her cash back, she'd been told she needed to prove the money wasn't connected to drug activity. An impossible standard that placed the burden of proof on the innocent rather than the accuser. And when she tried to file a complaint, she'd been laughed out of the sheriff's office. Marcus had listened to his sister cry for nearly an hour that night. He'd listened to the fear in her voice, the humiliation, the helpless rage of someone who had been victimized by the very people sworn to protect her. He'd listened to her describe the deputy's face, his sneer, his casual cruelty, his absolute certainty that there would be no consequences for his actions. And Marcus had made her a promise. Sitting in his apartment in Washington, D.C., with the phone pressed to his ear and his sister's sobs echoing through the line, he'd promised her that justice would come, that the man who had stolen her money and her dignity would pay for what he'd done, that Grayson County's reign of terror would end. It had taken 18 months to build the case. 18 months of quietly gathering complaints, documenting patterns, identifying victims who had been too afraid or too discouraged to come forward. 18 months of surveillance, of financial forensics, of building the kind of airtight federal case that no corrupt local official could escape. 67 complaints now sat in the FBI's files. 67 people who had been stopped, searched, humiliated, and robbed by the Grayson County Sheriff's Department. 67 stories of abuse that ranged from illegal searches to physical assault to outright theft under the color of law. And 47 of those complaints named the same deputy, Todd Mercer. Tonight, Marcus Webb was going to add himself to that list. Tonight, he was going to give Deputy Mercer enough rope to hang himself. Tonight, after 18 months of preparation, the trap was finally going to spring. He sat in the driver's seat of the rented Mercedes with his hands visible on the steering wheel, watching in the side mirror as the two deputies approached, and he felt nothing but cold, patient satisfaction. Keisha's promise was about to be kept. Grayson County had been corrupt for so long that most residents couldn't remember when it had been otherwise. The sheriff's department had been run by the same political machine for nearly 4 decades, passed from one good old boy to the next like a family heirloom. Sheriff Michael Rawlings was the latest in a long line of men who viewed the badge not as a symbol of public service, but as a license to operate beyond the reach of accountability. His department answered to no one. Internal affairs complaints were handled by Director Jonathan Hale, a man who had never in his 15-year tenure found a single complaint to be substantiated. The local district attorney, Patricia Brennan, declined to prosecute officers with such consistency that most residents had stopped even trying to report misconduct. It was a closed loop, a perfect circle of corruption that protected its own and crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. The complaints that had reached the federal government painted a picture of calculated predation. The department had figured out that targeting out-of-state vehicles, particularly those driven by minorities, was essentially risk-free. These drivers had no local connections, no political influence, no easy way to fight back. They could be stopped on pretextual violations, searched under manufactured probable cause, and stripped of their cash and valuables through civil asset forfeiture laws that required no criminal conviction. The seized money went into the department's budget. The seized vehicles went to auction with officers, often buying them at suspiciously low prices. The victims went home traumatized, humiliated, and usually too demoralized to fight a legal battle against a distant county where they knew the deck was stacked against them. It was in the coldest possible terms a profitable operation. And at the center of that operation stood Deputy Todd Mercer. Mercer had joined the department 12 years ago, recommended by his uncle who had served under the previous sheriff. He'd risen quickly, not through competence, but through compliance. He understood the unwritten rules. He knew which superiors to please and which corners to cut. He had a talent for intimidation that made him effective at extracting cooperation from reluctant civilians and an instinct for avoiding the kind of documented evidence that might cause problems, even in a county as protected as Grayson. Among his colleagues, he was known as the toll collector, a nickname that perfectly captured his specialty. Mercer worked the night shift on Route 119, the lonely stretch of highway that cut through the county's most isolated section. He waited in the darkness near abandoned gas stations and forest turnoffs, watching for out-of-state plates, luxury vehicles, and most importantly drivers whose appearance suggested they wouldn't have local connections to protect them. Over 12 years he had perfected his technique: the aggressive stop, the manufactured probable cause, the escalating intimidation, the seizure of cash and valuables, the implicit threat that things could get much worse if the victim didn't cooperate. 47 complaints had been filed against him. 47 victims had tried to seek justice through official channels. And 47 times Internal Affairs Director Hale had found insufficient evidence to support disciplinary action. Mercer was by any reasonable measure untouchable. Tonight his partner was Deputy Kevin Foley, a 24-year-old rookie who had been on the force for just 6 months. Foley had joined the department with idealistic notions about serving his community, protecting the innocent, and upholding the law. Those notions had been steadily eroding since his first week when he'd watched Mercer conduct a stop that bore no resemblance to anything they'd taught at the academy. But Foley had kept his mouth shut. He'd kept it shut when Mercer used slurs to describe the people they pulled over. He'd kept it shut when searches were conducted without consent or probable cause. He'd kept it shut when cash disappeared from wallets before being logged as evidence. The blue wall of silence was real, And Foley had learned quickly that breaking it meant ending his career, possibly his freedom, and certainly any chance of working in law enforcement again. The old hands had made that clear. The union representatives had reinforced it. The implicit threats had done the rest. So Foley rode along and he watched and he said nothing. And each night a little more of his idealism died. Tonight, as he stood by the rear bumper of the Mercedes watching Mercer approach the driver's side window, he felt the familiar twist of nausea in his gut. The familiar knowledge that something wrong was about to happen. And he was going to stand by and let it. He just had no idea how wrong it was about to go. Denise Chambers Webb had spent her entire career putting people like Deputy Mercer in prison. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a civil rights attorney who had marched with King, and a mother who had been one of the first black women to graduate from Emory Law School. She had been raised on stories of struggle and sacrifice, on dinner table conversations about constitutional rights and the ongoing battle for equality. She had understood from a very young age that the law could be either a weapon or a shield depending on who wielded it. She had chosen to become a prosecutor because she wanted to wield that weapon against those who abused their power. Specifically, she wanted to prosecute police officers who betrayed their oaths, officials who corrupted their offices, and anyone who used authority to victimize the vulnerable. Her path to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had been direct and deliberate. Undergraduate at Howard, law school at Georgetown, a clerkship with a federal judge who specialized in civil rights cases, and then the DOJ, where she had spent the past 10 years building cases that most prosecutors considered too difficult, too controversial, or too politically risky. She had convicted a sheriff in Alabama who had been running a work release program that was essentially forced labor. She had put away a prison warden in Louisiana who had been taking bribes to assign favorable cell placements. She had dismantled a police department in Georgia that had been fabricating evidence to inflate their conviction rates. She knew better than almost anyone in the federal government exactly how corrupt law enforcement could become when accountability failed, and she knew exactly what it took to hold those officers accountable. When Marcus had told her about the Grayson County investigation, she had insisted on being involved. Not just as a prosecutor reviewing files in a distant office, but as an active participant in the field operation that would finally bring the department down. He had resisted. The operation was dangerous. Things could go wrong. She was a lawyer, not a field agent, and the risks of having her present during an actual stop were significant. But she had been adamant. She wanted to see firsthand the tactics they had been documenting from complaint files. She wanted to hear with her own ears the language these officers used. She wanted to experience in her own body the fear and humiliation that 67 victims had described in their statements. And she wanted Deputy Mercer to know when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists that the woman he had threatened was the same woman who would be prosecuting him in federal court. There was, she admitted to herself, an element of personal satisfaction in that image. So she sat in the passenger seat of the rented Mercedes, her hidden recording device active, her legal mind cataloging every violation as it occurred, and she waited for her husband to complete the operation he had spent 18 months planning. In her designer handbag, alongside the lipstick and the business cards and the other props of her civilian cover, sat a second recording device that would provide backup footage in case the primary system failed. In the dashboard, concealed within what appeared to be an ordinary GPS unit, a pinhole camera was feeding live video to FBI Regional Command in Atlanta. The audio transmission was handled by the device in the metal case in the back seat, broadcasting everything that happened within a 50-foot radius to federal agents who were monitoring every word. The operation was documented from multiple angles, multiple sources, with redundancies built into redundancies. There would be no question about what happened tonight. There would be no room for the kind of he said, she said disputes that had allowed so many complaints to be dismissed in the past. When Denise saw the strobe lights erupt behind them, she felt her heart rate spike, despite her preparations. Knowing intellectually that she was protected by federal backup was one thing. Sitting in a car on a dark highway watching aggressive officers approach was something else entirely. She understood in that moment why so many victims had been too afraid to fight back, why the complaints had been filed and then abandoned, why the pattern had been allowed to continue for so long. The fear was real, the intimidation was effective, the isolation was overwhelming. But so was the recording equipment. She reached up and tapped the hidden camera twice, confirming it was active, and she prepared herself for whatever was about to happen. Deputy Todd Mercer approached the Mercedes with the swagger of a man who had done this hundreds of times before and had never once faced consequences. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a buzz cut that had gone grey at the temples and a jaw that seemed to be permanently clenched. His uniform was stretched tight across his gut, a testament to too many years of diner food and gas station coffee. But his size was still intimidating, and he knew how to use it. He kept his right hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered service weapon as he walked. It wasn't a conscious threat. Not exactly. It was just a reminder. A subtle signal that he controlled this interaction, that he held the power to escalate or de-escalate as he saw fit, that the people in this vehicle were entirely at his mercy. His left hand held a tactical flashlight, a 1,000-lumen monster that could temporarily blind anyone who looked directly into it. He kept it aimed at the driver's side mirror as he approached, knowing that the reflected glare would make it impossible for the driver to see him clearly. Advantage Mercer. Always. Behind him, Deputy Foley had taken up position near the rear bumper of the Mercedes. Standard protocol dictated that the backup officer maintain visibility on the vehicle's occupants while the primary officer made contact. But Foley's posture was wrong. Too tense. Too uncomfortable. His eyes kept darting around the empty highway as if looking for witnesses that both of them knew wouldn't be there. Route 119 was perfect for this kind of work precisely because there were never any witnesses. Mercer reached the driver's side window and didn't bother with the professional courtesy that academy training demanded. He didn't tap on the glass. He slammed his knuckles against it. Hard enough to make the thick Mercedes window rattle. Hard enough to make the woman in the passenger seat flinch. The window slid down with expensive smoothness. Climate-controlled air spilled out into the humid night, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and cologne. Everything about the car's interior screamed money. The seats were hand-stitched. The dashboard was brushed aluminum and polished wood. The briefcase in the back seat looked like it cost more than Mercer made in a month. His upper lip curled into something that was almost a smile, but was actually closer to a sneer. The driver was a black man in his early 40s, handsome in a clean-cut corporate way, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Mercer's first car. His hands were positioned carefully on the steering wheel, visible and unthreatening. His expression was calm, almost unnaturally so. That lack of fear immediately irritated Mercer. "Good evening, officer," the man said. His voice was deep and steady, educated in a way that Mercer found pretentious. "Is there a problem?" Mercer didn't answer the question. That wasn't how this worked. He asked the questions, he controlled the conversation, he set the terms of engagement. Instead, he leaned down and swept his flashlight across the interior of the car, letting the blinding beam rake across the driver's face, then across to the woman in the passenger seat. She was beautiful, he noticed, in that put-together professional way that always made him feel like he was being judged. Her designer handbag sat in the footwell, probably full of credit cards and cash. His mental calculator was already running. Finally, after letting the silence stretch long enough to establish dominance, Mercer spoke. "Whose car is this?" Not a greeting, not an explanation, just a demand. The driver didn't miss a beat. "It's a rental. Picked it up at the airport this morning." "A rental?" Mercer let the word hang in the humid air, loading it with disbelief. He let out a short, mocking laugh that contained absolutely no humor. "Sure it is. You people always have a story." He watched carefully for a reaction. Usually that phrase, "you people," generated a flash of anger, a moment of indignation that he could then use as justification for escalation. Suspects who showed attitude were automatically more dangerous, at least in his reports. But this driver didn't react. His expression remained placid. His hands stayed on the wheel. His breathing stayed even. "Where are you heading in such a hurry?" Mercer continued, probing for any crack in the man's composure. "We're not in a hurry," the driver replied. His tone was polite but precise, the tone of someone who was choosing each word deliberately. "I was doing exactly 45 miles per hour, which is the posted speed limit on this stretch of Route 119. We're heading back to our hotel." Mercer felt his jaw tighten. He didn't like the vocabulary, the specificity, the way the man had stated his exact speed as if he'd been monitoring it. He didn't like the absolute lack of intimidation in the driver's voice. Most people by this point in the interaction were at least showing some nervousness, stuttering, apologizing, trying to placate. This man was doing none of those things. "I didn't ask for a debate," Mercer snapped, letting his voice drop into the threatening register that usually got results. "I asked where you're going, and I asked whose car this is. Hand over your license, the rental agreement, and your insurance." He paused. "Now." The driver nodded once, a small controlled movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet, officer. It's in my suit jacket." He moved slowly, keeping one hand visible while the other retrieved a leather bifold from his breast pocket. He extracted a driver's license and handed it over along with papers that must have been the rental agreement. Mercer snatched the documents out of his hand and held the license up to his flashlight. The face in the photo matched the man in the car. The name read Marcus Webb. The address was somewhere in the Virginia suburbs, out of state. Perfect. Marcus Webb. Mercer read aloud, letting the name drip with skepticism. You got a record, Marcus? No, sir, I do not. We'll see about that. Mercer turned and thrust the license toward Foley, who had drifted closer during the interaction. Run this through dispatch, see if he's got any warrants. I'm going to have a little chat with our driver here. Foley took the license and retreated toward the cruiser, clearly relieved to have an excuse to step away from whatever was about to happen. Mercer watched him go, then turned his attention back to the interior of the Mercedes. His eyes settled on the woman in the passenger seat. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not anger. Something else. Something that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't identify. He decided he didn't like her. Smells like marijuana in here, Mercer announced. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced smoothness. He'd used this exact line dozens of times, maybe hundreds. It was the oldest trick in the book. The cornerstone of manufactured probable cause that had served him well throughout his career. The beauty of it was its simplicity. Smell was subjective. Impossible to disprove. A cop's claim that he detected marijuana was essentially an override code that unlocked any door, justified any search, and protected against any accusation of overreach. Courts had upheld it. Training officers had taught it. The whole department used it. The driver Webb, according to his license, didn't react with the usual panic. He didn't start stammering denials or suddenly become cooperative in hopes of avoiding escalation. His hands stayed exactly where they were. His posture remained relaxed, and his voice when he spoke carried that same infuriating steadiness. There is no marijuana in this vehicle, officer. Neither my wife nor I smoke. Wife. Mercer filed that information away. The woman in the passenger seat wasn't just a girlfriend or a colleague. She was this man's wife. That changed certain calculations, though he wasn't sure yet how. Oh, so you're calling me a liar now? Mercer leaned down further, bringing his face close to the open window, close enough that Webb must have been able to smell the coffee on his breath. He wanted the driver to feel his physical presence, to understand exactly how vulnerable he was in this moment. I say I smell weed. Mercer continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Which gives me probable cause to search this vehicle. He straightened up and took a step back, his hand still resting on his weapon. Step out of the car. For a long moment nothing happened. The driver sat motionless, his eyes meeting Mercer's without flinching. It was a look that Mercer had rarely seen during traffic stops. A look that contained no fear, no submission, no acknowledgement of the power dynamic that should have been obvious. It was the look of someone who was evaluating him, measuring him, filing away details for later use. Mercer felt a flash of something that might have been unease, quickly suppressed beneath years of conditioning and authority. I said, step out. The driver nodded once, that same controlled movement from before. I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt now, he said, narrating his actions in a way that felt like it was meant for an audience. I'm going to open my door slowly and exit the vehicle. He did exactly that. The door swung open and the driver rose to his full height. Mercer was a big man, but Marcus Webb was bigger, taller by at least 2 inches broader through the shoulders, carrying himself with the economical movement of someone who was completely comfortable in his own body. His suit jacket fell perfectly despite the heat and the movement. His eyes never left Mercer's face. For just an instant something cold flickered through Mercer's gut, an instinct honed by years of street work, whispering that this situation wasn't what it appeared to be, that he had miscalculated somehow. He crushed that instinct beneath the weight of his badge and his gun and his absolute certainty that he controlled this encounter. Hands on the hood, he ordered. Spread your legs. Webb complied, slowly placing his palms flat against the Mercedes' warm hood, widening his stance in the position that everyone recognized from 1,000 cop shows. His movements were measured and deliberate, designed to communicate cooperation while maintaining dignity. Back by the cruiser, Foley watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. This wasn't right. Nothing about the stop had been right from the beginning. There had been no traffic violation. The man was cooperating fully, and that claim about marijuana was pure fiction. Foley had been standing there the whole time, and he hadn't smelled anything but leather and air conditioning. He thought about saying something. He thought about the training manual and the department's official policies and the constitutional rights that were being violated in plain view. Then he thought about what had happened to the last rookie who had questioned Mercer's methods. The man was now working security at a warehouse 3 counties over. His law enforcement career finished before it really began. Foley kept his mouth shut. Mercer's hands were rough as they conducted the pat-down. There was nothing professional about it, nothing restrained. He grabbed at Webb's suit jacket with unnecessary force, checking pockets with invasive thoroughness. He ran his hands down the man's sides across his chest, along his legs, with a physicality that was designed to humiliate as much as to search. The wallet came out first. Mercer flipped it open, found a thick stack of cash, probably $300 or $400, and credit cards with the same name as the driver's license. He tossed it onto the hood of the Mercedes without logging its contents. The phone came next, a top-of-the-line smartphone in an expensive case. That went onto the hood as well. Car keys, business cards identifying Webb as something called a management consultant, a small leather case that contained reading glasses, nothing illegal, nothing even remotely suspicious. But Mercer wasn't looking for evidence anymore. He was looking for an angle, a justification, something that would allow him to escalate the stop into something profitable. "Where's the real stuff?" he demanded, stepping close enough that his chest almost touched Webb's back. "The cash you're transporting, the product. You think I don't know what you're really doing out here?" "I don't have any product," Webb replied. His voice remained steady, but there was a new edge to it now. Something hard and cold beneath the surface calm. "I don't have any cash beyond what was in my wallet. This vehicle has been in my possession since I rented it this morning, and there is nothing illegal inside it. We'll see about that." Mercer stepped back and turned toward the cruiser where Foley was standing like a statue. "Any warrants?" Foley shook his head, his face pale in the reflected strobe lights. "Clean. No warrants, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket." That should have ended it. Protocol dictated that a clean record and cooperative subject meant a warning, maybe a ticket for some fictional infraction, and a release. There was no legal basis to continue the stop. But Mercer had never let legal basis dictate his actions. "Keep him there," he ordered Foley. "I'm going to search the vehicle." "Todd," Foley's voice was barely audible. "Maybe we should just... Did I ask for your opinion, rookie?" The words were delivered with enough venom to silence any further objection. Foley's mouth closed, his protest dying stillborn, and he moved to stand beside Webb with his hand resting uncertainly on his own weapon. Mercer turned to the Mercedes. He started with the driver's seat, running his hands beneath it, checking the center console, rifling through the glove compartment. The rental agreement, insurance cards, a user manual for the vehicle. Nothing interesting. He moved to the back seat, shoving aside the briefcase, patting down the leather upholstery, pulling up floor mats. More nothing. His frustration was building now. A pressure in his chest that demanded release. These people thought they could drive through his county in their fancy car with their expensive clothes and their fancy educations, and they thought they were better than him. They thought they were untouchable. He was going to prove them wrong? His fingers found a seam in the leather of the rear armrest, a hidden compartment. He pried at it, his fingernails scraping against the material until the panel popped loose. Inside sat a heavy black metal case with a digital lock on the clasp. Mercer's heart rate spiked. Finally, while Mercer tore apart the back seat, Denise Chambers Webb sat motionless in the passenger seat, watching him in the rearview mirror, cataloging every violation for the prosecution she would eventually bring. Illegal stop, no stated probable cause, false claim of marijuana odor, warrantless search of the vehicle, aggressive physical contact during pat-down, failure to log seized property. The list was growing by the minute, and every second of it was being recorded. But her legal satisfaction couldn't entirely suppress the physical fear that had crept into her body. She had prosecuted officers who had done exactly what Mercer was doing now. She knew from dozens of case files exactly how badly these situations could escalate. She knew about the victims who had been beaten, tased, arrested on fabricated charges. She knew about the ones who had been shot. The badge on Mercer's chest didn't make him safe. If anything, it made him more dangerous. When Mercer's attention shifted from the back seat to the front, she felt her pulse quicken despite her best efforts at control. He was standing outside her window now, his flashlight beams sweeping across her face with the same invasive aggression he'd shown to Marcus. "Out of the car," he ordered. Denise complied slowly, announcing her movements the same way Marcus had. "I'm unbuckling my seatbelt. I'm opening the door. I'm stepping out." The night air hit her like a wall, heavy and humid after the air-conditioned interior of the Mercedes. She stood beside the car in her designer dress and her sensible heels, acutely aware of how vulnerable she was. Mercer was looking at her with an expression that made her skin crawl. Not the cold professional assessment of an officer evaluating a suspect. Something else. Something that reminded her of predators evaluating prey. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands on the car." "Officer, I would like to know the legal basis for—" "I said turn around." His hand closed on her arm before she could comply voluntarily. Thick fingers gripping hard enough to leave bruises, spinning her around with enough force that she nearly lost her balance on the gravel shoulder. Her palms slammed against the warm metal of the Mercedes as she caught herself. The pat-down that followed was worse than what Marcus had endured. Mercer's hands lingered where they shouldn't. His search of her pockets was unnecessarily thorough. His check of her waistband invasive in ways that had nothing to do with searching for weapons or contraband. Denise forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember that this was all being recorded, that this man was building his own prison sentence with every inappropriate touch. But her hands were shaking when he finally stepped back. "Nice dress," Mercer commented, his tone making the compliment sound like a threat. "Expensive. Where'd a girl like you get money for clothes like that?" "I'm an attorney," Denise replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I work for the federal government." Mercer laughed. It was an ugly sound full of mockery and disbelief. "Sure you are. And I'm the president. You people love your fancy stories." From his position near the Mercedes hood, Marcus watched the interaction with fists clenched at his sides. Every protective instinct in his body was screaming at him to intervene, to stop this man from putting his hands on his wife, to use the training that had been drilled into him through years of combat and law enforcement. But he stayed still. This was the operation. This was the evidence they needed. And Denise had known exactly what she was signing up for when she insisted on being here. That knowledge didn't make it any easier to watch. Deputy Foley, standing nearby with his hand on his weapon, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. His face was pale, his posture screaming discomfort, his eyes fixed on the ground rather than the scene unfolding in front of him. "Todd," he said quietly, "maybe we should just let them go. There's nothing here." Mercer whirled on him with fury in his eyes. "Did I ask you, rookie? Did I ask for your professional opinion? You've been on the job for 5 minutes. You don't know anything about real police work. Now shut your mouth and secure the female suspect while I finish searching the vehicle." Foley's mouth opened, then closed. Whatever objection he'd been about to voice died in his throat. The blue wall of silence held firm. Mercer returned to the Mercedes with renewed determination. He'd found the hidden compartment, he'd found the metal case, and he was absolutely certain that whatever was inside would justify everything he'd done tonight and probably set him up for a substantial seizure under civil forfeiture laws. The case sat on the back seat where he'd left it, heavy and solid, its digital lock glowing faint red in the darkness. He picked it up, feeling its weight, already calculating what it might contain. Cash, probably. Maybe jewelry or gold. Possibly drugs, though that seemed less likely given the apparent class of the vehicle's occupants. Whatever it was his now. "What's the combination?" he demanded, carrying the case to where Webb still stood with his hands on the hood of the Mercedes. Webb turned his head slightly, looking at the case, then at Mercer. "That's private property," he said. His voice had changed now, lost some of its patient steadiness. There was something harder beneath the surface, something that almost sounded like a warning. Opening it without a warrant would be a federal crime. Federal? There was that word again. Mercer didn't like it. "A federal crime?" he repeated mockingly. "You hear that, Foley? Our friend here is worried about federal crimes. Driving through Grayson County with a locked case full of who knows what, and he's worried about my legal exposure." He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let me tell you something, Marcus." Mercer stepped closer, using the first name with deliberate disrespect. "I've been working this highway for 12 years. I've searched 1,000 vehicles. I've seized more cash and contraband than you've ever seen in your life. And you know what? The federal government has never once, not one single time, given a damn about what happens on Route 119. Because the federal government doesn't care about places like Grayson County. They don't care about people like you, and they sure as hell don't care about protecting you from people like me." He held up the metal case. "So I'm going to ask you one more time. What's the combination?" Webb met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not going to give it to you." "Wrong answer." Mercer pulled his baton from his belt with practiced speed. The telescoping steel extended with a sharp click, and before anyone could react, he brought it down on the digital lock with crushing force. The lock shattered, The case's lid popped open, and Todd Mercer's entire world began to collapse. The first thing Mercer saw was velvet. Black velvet, the kind used to display jewelry. Or he thought with rising excitement something valuable that needed protection. He reached into the case, his thick fingers closing around the first object his hand found. It was heavy, solid metal, shaped like... He pulled it out, and the breath left his lungs. It was a badge, but not like any badge he'd ever seen. Not the cheap tin shields that some idiots tried to pass off as legitimate credentials. This was something else entirely. Heavy brass, meticulously detailed with raised lettering that caught the light from his flashlight. He turned it over, reading the words even as his brain refused to process them. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The seal of the Department of Justice was embossed above those words, the eagle and shield unmistakable, the craftsmanship beyond anything that could be faked. Supervisory Special Agent. His fingers began to shake. Marcus T. Webb. Mercer stared at the badge. He stared at the man who was no longer positioned submissively against the Mercedes hood, who had straightened up, turned around, and was now watching him with an expression that contained no fear at all. No fear, because why would there be fear? The man standing 10 feet away wasn't a corporate consultant who had wandered into the wrong county. He wasn't an easy mark, a vulnerable target, another victim to be shaken down and sent on his way. He was an FBI agent, a supervisory special agent, a federal officer with the full weight and authority of the United States government behind him. And Mercer had just assaulted him, searched him, put his hands on his wife, broken into his official credentials. The case contained more. Mercer could see it through his terror-blurred vision, an identification card with a photograph that matched the man in front of him. A communication device of some kind blinking with a small green light that suggested it was active. Other equipment that he didn't recognize but that screamed federal authority. His hands were shaking so badly now that he nearly dropped the badge. His heart was hammering against his ribs. The humid night air suddenly felt cold against the sweat that had broken out across his entire body. 12 years on the force, hundreds of stops, thousands of dollars seized, 47 complaints all dismissed, and in the space of 30 seconds, all of it had come crashing down. "That's impossible," he heard himself say, his voice emerging as a croak. "You're not." "Read it again," Webb said. His voice was calm, controlled, utterly without mercy. "Read it out loud, Todd. I want to make sure the recording picks it up clearly." "Recording." The word hit Mercer like a physical blow. He looked at the communication device in the case, the one with the blinking green light, and suddenly understood what that light meant. Transmission. Broadcasting. Someone was listening. Someone had been listening this entire time. Everything he'd said, everything he'd done, every violation, every threat, every touch, all of it was on the record. The next few seconds stretched into an eternity. Mercer stood frozen, his body refusing to obey any command his panicked brain tried to send. The federal badge was still in his shaking hand, the weight of it somehow heavier than before, as if it had transformed from evidence into an anchor dragging him toward the bottom of an abyss. Behind him he heard Foley make a sound, a whimper or a prayer or something in between. The rookie had seen the badge too, had understood immediately what it meant, and whatever remained of his naive faith in the blue wall of silence was crumbling visibly. "Oh God," Foley whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Mercer's mind raced through possibilities, grasping desperately for some explanation that would make this not real. The badge was fake. It had to be fake. Some elaborate scheme to entrap honest officers. A sting operation that he could still escape if he just handled it correctly. "This is a setup," he said, and he could hear the desperation in his own voice, the fear that was replacing his swagger. "You're not really FBI. Nobody real would just let themselves get searched like that. This is fake, all of it. You stole this badge, or you bought it online, or... Deputy Mercer." The woman's voice cut through his babbling like a blade through flesh. She had moved while he was focused on the badge. She was no longer standing meekly by the Mercedes where Foley had been supposedly securing her. She was standing straight, shoulders back, and her entire bearing had transformed. The vulnerable civilian in the designer dress was gone, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. "I'm going to need you to listen very carefully," she said, "because what I'm about to tell you is going to determine whether you spend the next decade in federal prison or the next 2 decades. Her voice was cold, razor sharp, radiated an authority that made his badge feel like a toy. "My name is Assistant United States Attorney Denise Chambers Webb. I am the lead prosecutor for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The man you've just assaulted is not only a federal agent but my husband. And that communication device you're looking at has been transmitting live audio to the FBI's Regional Command Center in Atlanta for the past 25 minutes. The words hit him one at a time, each one a separate blow. Assistant United States Attorney, Lead Prosecutor, Civil Rights Division, live audio, Atlanta. They have been listening?" She continued, each word precise and devastating, "to every single thing you have said tonight. Every threat, every violation, every slur, every time you put your hands on either of us without legal justification. It's all on the record, Deputy. Every second of it." Mercer's hand moved toward his holster without conscious thought. Not to draw, he wasn't that far gone, not yet, but instinctively seeking the comfort of his weapon, the familiar weight that had always made him feel powerful. "I would strongly advise against touching that weapon." The voice came from the darkness, not from Webb, not from his wife. From somewhere beyond the circle of light cast by the Mercedes headlights, out in the pine forest that had seemed so empty, so perfectly isolated, so safe. Mercer spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam slashing through the humid air, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. And then the shadows began to move. Mercer's survival instinct kicked in before his rational mind could catch up. He couldn't accept what was happening, couldn't process the implications, couldn't allow his brain to follow the logical chain of consequences that would lead from this moment to a prison cell. So instead he did what cornered animals do. He fought back. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is entrapment. You people targeted me, provoked me, tried to make me Deputy Mercer." Webb's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. "You weren't targeted. You targeted yourself. You pulled us over. You manufactured probable cause. You conducted an illegal search. You assaulted both of us. Nobody forced you to do any of that." "Shut up!" Mercer's hand closed around his weapon, not drawing it, but gripping the handle like a lifeline. "You don't get to talk to me. You're under arrest. Both of you. For impersonating federal officers." For what?" Denise interrupted. "For carrying authentic credentials, for driving through a public highway, for failing to submit quietly while you violated our constitutional rights." She stepped forward, and Mercer instinctively stepped back. "Here's what's going to happen, Deputy. In approximately 3 minutes, federal agents are going to arrive at this location. They are going to place you under arrest. They are going to read you your rights, and then they are going to transport you to a federal holding facility where you will await arraignment on charges that carry a minimum of 10 years in federal prison." "You're lying." But his voice had lost all conviction. "I'm a prosecutor," Denise replied. "I don't lie." She paused. "I convict." Mercer's eyes darted to Foley, seeking some kind of support, some ally in this nightmare. But Foley had backed away, his hands raised slightly from his sides, his face a mask of pure terror. "Todd," Foley said, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to arrest them," Mercer said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. "We need to control the situation before what?" Webb cut in. He hadn't moved from his position, hadn't made any threatening gestures, but somehow he dominated the scene through sheer presence. "Before you dig this hole any deeper, Deputy, you're already looking at assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, illegal search and seizure, and probably a dozen other charges I haven't even catalogued yet. Every second you continue this farce is another count on the indictment." "You don't understand." Mercer was babbling now, the words tumbling out without thought. "This is my county. This is my highway. I've been doing this for 12 years, and nobody has ever. The department protects internal affairs, always." "Internal affairs works for your sheriff," Denise said. "We work for the federal government. Different rules apply." Something in Mercer's expression shifted. The desperation hardened into something uglier, more dangerous. If he was going down, some primitive part of his brain reasoned he might as well go down fighting. "Foley," he ordered. "Cuff the suspect, the male suspect. Put him in the cruiser." Foley didn't move. His face had gone grey. "That's an order, Deputy." "Todd, I can't. They're federal." "I don't care if they're the President of the United States. I'm your training officer, and I'm ordering you to secure the suspect." For a long, terrible moment, Foley stood paralyzed between two impossible choices: obey his training officer and become complicit in what was rapidly becoming a federal crime, or refuse and end his career, destroy his relationship with the department, become an outcast among the only professional community he'd ever known. The blue wall of silence demanded loyalty above all else, but the blue wall had never demanded that he kidnap federal agents. "I'm sorry, Todd," Foley whispered. And then with hands that shook violently, he reached for his own handcuffs and stepped toward Marcus Webb. The cuffs clicked shut around Webb's wrists. A federal agent was now in custody, and somewhere in the darkness the consequences were already moving. The moment the handcuffs closed, something changed in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of the darkness surrounding them, a tension that seemed to emanate from the pine trees, from the empty highway, from the very air itself. The cicadas had stopped singing. The night had gone utterly, completely silent. Denise Chambers Webb stood beside the Mercedes, watching her husband be handcuffed by a trembling rookie who could barely look at what he was doing. Her heart was pounding, but not with fear anymore, with something closer to anticipation. She had been waiting for this moment. "Deputy Foley," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the unnatural silence, "I want you to understand something. What you just did, placing those handcuffs on a federal agent, is going to be a defining moment of your life. You have approximately 2 minutes to decide which kind of defining moment it will be." Foley looked at her with the eyes of a drowning man. "You can continue to follow Deputy Mercer's orders. You can transport my husband to your station. You can process him through your booking system. And when the federal response arrives, and it will arrive, Deputy, I promise you that you will be charged as a co-conspirator in the kidnapping of a federal officer. That charge carries a mandatory minimum of 15 years. She let that number hang in the air. "Or," she continued, "you can remove those handcuffs right now. You can step away from Deputy Mercer, and when the federal agents get here, you can cooperate fully with their investigation. Tell them everything you've witnessed, every stop you've seen Mercer conduct, every complaint you've heard discussed, every violation you've been ordered to ignore." "Don't listen to her," Mercer shouted. "She's trying to turn you against—" "I'm trying to save him," Denise cut in. "Which is more than you've ever done. How many rookies have you trained, Todd? How many young officers have you taught to lie on reports, to plant evidence, to shake down motorists for cash? How many careers have you corrupted?" Mercer's face contorted with rage. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the night. It came from the pine forest to their left, deep, commanding, utterly without fear. "Deputy Mercer, Deputy Foley, this is Special Agent in Charge Thomas Brennan of the FBI Atlanta Field Office. You are surrounded by federal agents. I strongly suggest you do exactly what you're told." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mercer spun, his flashlight beam slashing through the darkness, searching for the source. He found nothing but shadows, and then the shadows began to burn. Headlights erupted from both directions on Route 119, not the ordinary headlights of passing vehicles, but coordinated, tactical, moving in formation. The darkness that had seemed so complete, so isolating, was suddenly filled with the roar of engines and the blaze of high-powered lights. Black SUVs materialized from the night. 5 of them, then 6. Their matte finishes swallowing light. Their windows impenetrable. They converged on the scene from every direction, blocking escape routes that Mercer hadn't even realized he was calculating. The lead vehicle stopped 30 feet away, its high beams pinning Mercer in place like an insect on a mounting board. The door opened, and Deputy Todd Mercer finally understood that his 12-year reign of terror had come to an end. The man who stepped out of the lead Suburban was not what Mercer had expected. He wasn't dressed in tactical gear like the agents who were now pouring out of the other vehicles, forming a perimeter with the efficiency of a military operation. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this many times before and had never once failed. Special Agent in Charge. Thomas Brennan was a legend in federal law enforcement circles. 30 years with the Bureau. The last 15 spent dismantling corrupt police departments across the American South. He had taken down sheriffs in Alabama, police chiefs in Louisiana, entire departments in Georgia and Mississippi. He had testified before Congress. He had been profiled in national newspapers. He was the man the Department of Justice sent when they wanted to send a message. And tonight the message was for Grayson County. Brennan walked directly toward the scene, his eyes taking in everything. The Mercedes with its doors hanging open, the police cruiser with its lights still flashing, Marcus Webb standing in handcuffs, Denise Webb with her arms crossed, Deputy Foley looking like he was about to vomit, and Deputy Todd Mercer frozen in place with a federal badge still clutched in his shaking hand. "Deputy Mercer," Brennan said, his voice carrying easily across the gravel shoulder, "I'm going to need you to place your weapon on the ground, slowly, using only 2 fingers. Mercer didn't move. Couldn't move. His brain was still trying to process what was happening, still searching for some explanation that would make this not real. "Deputy, I won't ask again." 4 red laser dots appeared on Mercer's chest, 1 for each of the tactical agents who had taken position around the scene. They weren't warning shots, they were targeting solutions. If Mercer so much as twitched toward his weapon, he would be dead before his hand reached the holster. Slowly, with movements that seemed to take enormous effort, Mercer reached down and unholstered his service weapon using 2 fingers exactly as instructed. He placed it on the gravel at his feet and stepped back, his hands rising automatically above his head. "The rest of it," Brennan ordered. "Taser, baton, pepper spray, radio, all of it." One by one, Mercer stripped away the tools of his authority. Each item hit the gravel with a small final sound. The taser, the baton he'd used to smash the federal case, the pepper spray, the radio that connected him to a department that would not be coming to save him. When he was done, he stood stripped of everything that had made him powerful, just a man in a uniform that suddenly seemed far too large, far too heavy, far too much like a costume he was no longer permitted to wear. Brennan turned to Foley. "Deputy, remove the handcuffs from Agent Webb. Now!" Foley practically ran to comply. His hands shook so badly that he dropped the handcuff keys twice before managing to fit them into the lock. The cuffs fell away, and Marcus Webb stepped free, rubbing his wrists where the steel had bitten into his skin. "You all right, Marcus?" Brennan asked, his voice softening slightly for the first time. "I'm fine, Tom." Webb straightened his suit jacket, adjusted his tie, ran a hand over his close-cropped hair. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, designed to communicate that he had never for one moment lost control of the situation. "Ready to proceed?" Brennan nodded and turned back to Mercer. "Todd Mercer," he said, and his voice carried the weight of the entire federal government. "You are under arrest. The charges will be detailed during your arraignment, but they include assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, illegal search and seizure, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." 2 tactical agents approached Mercer from behind. They grabbed his arms, roughly yanking them behind his back with the same aggressive force he had used on so many of his own victims. The click of federal handcuffs closing around his wrists was the loudest sound Mercer had ever heard. It sounded like a cell door slamming shut. As the agents marched him toward one of the waiting SUVs, Mercer's mind raced through every possibility, every angle, every desperate scheme that might still save him. He would call the union. The Police Benevolent Association had lawyers who handled exactly this kind of situation. They would claim entrapment. They would argue that the FBI had provoked him, targeted him, set him up. They would paint him as a dedicated officer who had been victimized by federal overreach. It had worked before. Maybe not for crimes this serious, but the union had gotten officers out of tight spots. They knew how to work the system, how to delay and obstruct and bargain until charges were reduced or dropped entirely. Internal affairs would back him up. Director Hale had buried 47 complaints. He wasn't about to let the feds waltz in and expose the department's dirty laundry. There would be pressure from above, from the sheriff, from the county commissioners, from everyone who had benefited from the way things worked in Grayson County. The district attorney would intervene. Patricia Brennan, no relation to the FBI agent, despite the name, had made her career by declining to prosecute officers. She understood how the game was played. She would find some reason to question the federal case, to raise jurisdictional issues, to throw sand in the gears of justice until momentum was lost. These thoughts cascaded through Mercer's mind in the space of seconds, each one a lifeline he was grasping desperately. But another part of his brain, the part that had survived 12 years on the street by reading situations, accurately knew the truth. This was different. The FBI hadn't stumbled onto this scene by accident. They hadn't been conducting random surveillance of Route 119. They had been here, waiting, ready, with 6 vehicles and a dozen agents and a special agent in charge who had taken down entire departments. This was an operation, a planned, coordinated takedown with months of preparation behind it, which meant they had evidence. Not just from tonight, but from before. From other stops, other victims, other complaints that hadn't been buried quite as deeply as Hale had believed. And that communication device in the metal case, the one that had been broadcasting live audio to Atlanta for the past half hour, meant that everything Mercer had said and done tonight was already in federal hands. No chance to adjust his story, no opportunity to coordinate with Foley, no way to claim that the aggressive black man had attacked him first. The union couldn't spin recorded audio. Internal Affairs couldn't bury video evidence. The district attorney couldn't decline to prosecute a federal case. Mercer had been caught, completely and inescapably, in a trap of his own making. As the agents shoved him into the back of the SUV, he looked out through the tinted window at the scene he was leaving behind. Webb was standing with his wife now, the two of them speaking quietly to Agent Brennan. Foley was being guided toward a separate vehicle, his hands not cuffed, but his freedom clearly over. The Mercedes sat abandoned on the gravel shoulder, its doors still open, a silent witness to everything that had happened. And in that moment, Mercer understood. He was never going back to Grayson County. He was never going to wear that uniform again. He was never going to feel the weight of a badge on his chest, or a gun on his hip, or the intoxicating power of controlling someone else's fate. That life was over. The door slammed shut, sealing him in darkness. On the gravel shoulder, Marcus Webb stood with his wife and watched the convoy of SUVs prepare to depart. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from months of planning finally reaching their culmination. He had been working this case since the day after Keisha's phone call, building evidence, identifying victims, mapping the network of corruption that had allowed Mercer and officers like him to operate with impunity for more than a decade. 67 complaints, 67 people who had been victimized by the Grayson County Sheriff's Department. 67 stories of abuse that ranged from illegal searches to physical assault to outright theft. Some of those victims had been too afraid to pursue their complaints. Others had been actively discouraged by the department's internal affairs process. A few had tried to fight and had been crushed by a system designed to protect the predators rather than the prey. But all of them would have justice now. Brennan approached his expression a mixture of satisfaction and the particular weariness that came from doing this job for 3 decades. "Good work," he said simply. "Clean capture, solid evidence, minimal complications." "The rookie talked," Marcus replied. "Foley, he started cooperating the moment he saw the badges." Brennan nodded. "We'll see how cooperative he stays when the union lawyers get to him, but for now he's our witness. He can testify to Mercer's methods, to the pattern of stops, to everything he's seen in the past 6 months. What about the rest of the department? Raids are scheduled for 6 a.m. Brennan glanced at his watch. "About 5 hours from now. We're hitting the sheriff's office internal affairs, the district attorney's office, and the county impound lot. Warrants are already signed. By noon tomorrow, Grayson County's entire law enforcement structure is going to be under federal supervision." Denise stepped forward. "And prosecutions? We've got enough for at least 15 indictments right now. Sheriff Rawlings I, a Director Hale, D.A. Brennan Mercer, and about a dozen deputies who were either directly involved or actively covered up the misconduct." Brennan allowed himself a small, grim smile. "This department has been operating like a criminal enterprise for years. We're going to treat it like one." Marcus looked out at the empty highway, at the darkness that had seemed so threatening an hour ago. The pine trees still rose like sentinels on either side of the road, but they didn't feel oppressive anymore. They felt like witnesses, silent observers of a moment when justice had finally, after years of delay, found its way to Grayson County. "I want to be there," he said quietly, "when they arrest the sheriff, when they take down the people who protected Mercer all these years." Brennan studied him for a long moment. "This is personal for you." It wasn't a question. "My sister was victim number 43, Marcus replied. "She was driving through here 18 months ago. Mercer stopped her, searched her, took $600 in cash, impounded her car. She called me from the side of this highway crying so hard she could barely speak." He paused, letting the memory wash over him. "I made her a promise that night. Told her I would make sure the people who did that to her would pay. That Grayson County would never be able to hurt anyone else the way they hurt her." Brennan nodded slowly. "You'll be there." They stood in silence for a moment. 3 federal officers on a dark highway, contemplating the magnitude of what they had set in motion. Then Brennan's phone buzzed. "That's our signal," he said, checking the screen. "Convoy's ready to move. We need to get Mercer processed and start preparing the warrant executions." He turned toward his vehicle, then paused. "Marcus, what you did tonight, putting yourself in that situation, letting him put his hands on you, on Denise, that took courage. Not many agents would have had the patience to let it play out the way you did." Marcus glanced at his wife, who was standing beside him with an expression that mixed exhaustion with something fierce and proud. "It wasn't about patience," he said. "It was about making sure there were no loopholes, no technicalities, no way for union lawyers to claim their client was provoked or entrapped. Mercer made every choice himself. He initiated every violation, and now he's going to live with the consequences of those choices for the rest of his life." Brennan nodded once more and walked away. Marcus and Denise stood alone on the gravel shoulder, the flashing lights of the departing convoy painting their faces in alternating red and blue. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Denise took her husband's hand. "It's done," she said quietly. "No." Marcus squeezed her fingers. "It's just beginning. But the hardest part is over. The rest is just paperwork and court dates." They walked back to the Mercedes, which an FBI technician had already cleared for them to drive away. The hidden cameras had been retrieved. The communication equipment had been collected as evidence. The rental car was just a rental car again, no longer a trap waiting to spring. Marcus slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The jazz music came back on automatically, the same smooth saxophone that had been playing when the sirens first erupted behind them. He pulled onto Route 119 and drove away into the darkness, leaving behind the spot where Deputy Todd Mercer's life had ended. And a new chapter in Grayson County's history had begun. The next 12 hours transformed Grayson County into a scene from a federal law enforcement operation. At exactly 6 a.m., as the first grey light of dawn crept over the pine forests, convoys of FBI vehicles descended on locations throughout the county. They came in force, overwhelming numbers designed to prevent resistance and ensure compliance. Their presence impossible to ignore. The sheriff's department was the first target. Agents in tactical gear secured the perimeter of the building while others stormed through the front doors, serving warrants on stunned deputies who had arrived for the morning shift expecting an ordinary day. Evidence boxes were carried out in a steady stream, computers, filing cabinets, records that had been sealed for decades. Sheriff Michael Rawlings was arrested in his home, still in his bathrobe, his morning coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter as agents read him his rights. He had been with the department for 32 years, the last 15 as sheriff. He had overseen every cover-up, approved every dismissal, protected every officer who had crossed the line. His protests about jurisdictional overreach fell on deaf ears. Federal warrants trumped county authority. Internal Affairs Director Jonathan Hale was next. The agents found him at his desk, frantically feeding documents into a shredder when they breached his office door. The shredder was seized along with everything else, its half-destroyed contents to be reconstructed by forensic specialists who had become very good at putting incriminating evidence back together. Hale demanded his lawyer. He was informed that he would be provided one at the federal holding facility. Not before. District Attorney Patricia Brennan proved the most difficult to locate. She had somehow received warning and had attempted to flee the county, making it almost to the state line before a federal checkpoint stopped her vehicle. She was arrested on the shoulder of Interstate 20, much the same way her department had arrested so many innocent motorists over the years. The irony was not lost on the agents who took her into custody. Throughout the morning, the arrests continued. Deputies who had worked alongside Mercer, who had turned blind eyes to his methods, who had helped cover up complaints and intimidate victims, found themselves on the wrong side of handcuffs for the first time in their careers. By noon, 15 people were in federal custody. By evening, that number had grown to 22. The Grayson County Sheriff's Department effectively ceased to exist, its functions temporarily assumed by federal marshals who would maintain order until a legitimate replacement could be established. The news media descended with the enthusiasm of sharks sensing blood. National networks sent correspondents. Local stations ran continuous coverage. The story of a corrupt Southern Sheriff's Department finally being brought to justice proved irresistible, especially when the details emerged of how that justice had been achieved. The traffic stop video was leaked within 48 hours. Despite federal attempts to control its release until trial, someone, perhaps a disgruntled former employee of the department, perhaps someone with access to the FBI's evidence chain, uploaded the footage to social media, where it immediately went viral. The nation watched Deputy Todd Mercer slam his knuckles against the window of a Mercedes on a dark highway. They watched him use slurs and manufacture probable cause and assault two people whose only crime had been driving through the wrong county. They watched him break open a federal evidence case and stare in horror at the badge inside. and they watched federal agents materialize from the darkness, surrounding the scene, ending Mercer's reign of terror in a matter of seconds. The video was viewed 20 million times in its first week. Deputy Todd Mercer became one of the most recognizable faces in America, though not in the way he had ever imagined. The federal courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi was a fortress of marble and security, designed to project the weight and majesty of federal justice. On the morning of Todd Mercer's arraignment, the building was surrounded by media vans and protesters, both those demanding justice and those claiming persecution of law enforcement. Security had been tripled. Every entrance was monitored, every corridor patrolled. Inside courtroom 3, Mercer sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to have swallowed him. The swagger was gone. The bulk he had carried so intimidatingly had deflated somehow, leaving a man who looked smaller, weaker, more pathetic than anyone who had encountered him on Route 119 would have believed. His court-appointed attorney sat beside him, a public defender who had drawn the short straw and was now tasked with defending the indefensible. The lawyer's expression suggested he was already calculating how quickly he could negotiate a plea deal. The prosecution table was fuller. Assistant United States Attorney Denise Chambers Webb sat at its center, surrounded by colleagues who would help her present the case. She looked composed, professional, utterly confident in the evidence they had assembled. Sitting in the gallery 1 row behind the prosecution table was Marcus Webb. He was not there in an official capacity. He had recused himself from any prosecutorial role given his personal involvement in the arrest. But no one had objected to his presence as an observer. He wanted to see this, needed to see it. The judge entered and everyone rose. The Honorable Arthur Pendleton was a federal district judge with a reputation for strict adherence to the law and zero tolerance for police corruption. His assignment to this case was not coincidental. The Department of Justice had specifically requested him, knowing that any attempt by the defense to claim judicial bias would fail against his impeccable record. The arraignment itself was brief, almost anticlimactic. Charges were read: assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, illegal search and seizure, conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice. Each count was a separate indictment, a separate potential sentence, a separate weight pressing down on the defendant. Mercer pleaded not guilty to all charges. His attorney requested bail, citing his client's deep roots in the community and lack of flight risk. The prosecution objected. Denise stood and laid out in calm and devastating detail the risk that Mercer would attempt to intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, or flee prosecution. She cited his history of violent behavior. She referenced the recorded audio of his threats. She reminded the court that the defendant had been found with a federal agent in handcuffs and had been on the verge of transporting him to a local jail when the arrest occurred. Your Honor, she concluded, the defendant spent 12 years operating as if he were above the law. He abused his authority to victimize hundreds of citizens. He has demonstrated through his own recorded words and actions a willingness to use violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. He is a clear danger to the community and a significant flight risk. The United States requests that he be held without bail. Judge Pendleton considered for approximately 30 seconds before ruling. Bail denied. The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending trial. Mercer sagged visibly. His attorney whispered something in his ear, probably platitudes about appeals and future motions. But Mercer didn't seem to hear. He was staring at Marcus Webb. Their eyes met across the courtroom. And in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the predator finally comprehending that he had met something more dangerous than himself. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply held Mercer's gaze until the marshals led the defendant away. It wasn't over yet. There would be a trial, there would be testimony evidence presentation, legal arguments, there would be attempts by the defense to suppress evidence, to challenge procedures, to find some technicality that might save their client. But looking at Mercer's broken posture as he shuffled out of the courtroom, Marcus knew how this would end. Justice was coming, and nothing could stop it now. The trial of Todd Mercer lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision, building layer upon layer of evidence that buried any possible defense. The video from the traffic stop was played for the jury, every humiliating moment projected on screens that the defendant could not avoid watching. The audio was enhanced and replayed, Mercer's own voice damning him with each slur, each threat, each manufactured claim of probable cause. Marcus Webb took the stand on the 7th day. He walked to the witness box with the same controlled dignity he had displayed during the traffic stop, The same unshakable calm that had so infuriated Mercer on that dark highway. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. And then he did. He told the jury about his career with the FBI, about the corrupt departments he had dismantled, the dirty officers he had brought to justice, about the morning 18 months ago when his sister had called him sobbing from the side of Route 119, describing her humiliation at the hands of a deputy who had seen her skin color and assumed she was a criminal. He told them about the investigation, about the 67 complaints, the pattern of abuse, the wall of silence that had protected predators for decades, about the decision to conduct a field operation, to put himself in the same position as all those other victims, to experience firsthand the tactics that had been documented in complaint after complaint. And he told them about that night, about the aggressive stop, about the manufactured probable cause, about being forced to his knees on the gravel, searched without justification, handcuffed for the crime of driving while black through Grayson County. The defense attorney tried to rattle him on cross-examination, tried to suggest entrapment, to imply that the FBI had targeted an innocent officer, to paint Marcus as an agent with a personal vendetta who had manipulated the situation. Marcus dismantled each accusation with the precision of someone who had testified in federal court dozens of times. "I did not provoke Deputy Mercer," he stated, his voice level and clear. "I followed every instruction he gave. I announced my movements before making them. I was polite, cooperative, and compliant. Every escalation came from him. Every violation was his choice. The only thing I did was fail to be intimidated by his badge, and apparently that was crime enough in his eyes." The jury watched. The jury listened. The jury remembered the video they had seen, the audio they had heard, the evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. On the 19th day of trial, after 17 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Mercer wept as the foreman read the verdict, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. That reduced the man who had terrorized a county for 12 years to a pathetic figure in an orange jumpsuit. Marcus watched without expression. This was the moment he had worked toward for 18 months. This was the promise kept. But there was no triumph in watching a man's life collapse, even a man who deserved everything that was happening to him. There was only the grim satisfaction of justice finally served. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was packed again. Not just with media, but with faces Marcus recognized from the case files. Victims who had traveled from across the country to see the man who had humiliated them finally face consequences. Family members of people who had been brutalized on Route 119. Community leaders from Grayson County who had spent years fighting against a corrupt system. They had come to bear witness. Judge Pendleton entered and the room rose with a rustle of anticipation. He took his seat behind the bench and studied the defendant who sat slumped at the defense table, all pretense of innocence abandoned. "Mr. Mercer," Pendleton began, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "you have been found guilty of multiple federal offenses, including assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. Before I pronounce sentence, I will allow you to make a statement." Mercer's attorney whispered something, probably coaching him on what to say. But Mercer waved him off. He stood slowly as if his body had aged decades in the past months and faced the judge. "I was doing my job," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable as the confident bark that had demanded compliance from hundreds of motorists. "Everything I did because I thought I was protecting my community. I made mistakes. I know that now, but I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just trying to be a good cop." The courtroom stirred. Someone in the gallery made a sound of disgust. Judge Pendleton's expression didn't change. "Is that all, Mr. Mercer?" "I'm sorry," Mercer added, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything." Pendleton nodded slowly. "Mr. Mercer, in my 32 years on the bench, I have heard a great many apologies. Some were genuine. Most were not. I cannot read hearts, so I cannot tell you which category yours falls into. But I can tell you this." He leaned forward. "You were not protecting your community. You were preying on it. You used your badge as a weapon to terrorize people who had done nothing wrong. You manufactured crimes to justify your aggression. You stole money from innocent motorists and called it law enforcement. You were in every meaningful sense a criminal in uniform." Pendleton's voice hardened. The testimony in this trial revealed a pattern of abuse spanning 12 years, 67 documented complaints, 47 directly naming you, men and women who were humiliated, robbed, assaulted, all because they made the mistake of driving through your county with the wrong skin color. And every time a complaint was filed, your department protected you. Your union protected you. Your internal affairs protected you. You operated with absolute impunity, and it corrupted you absolutely. He picked up a document from his bench. I have reviewed the sentencing guidelines. I have considered the prosecution's recommendations and the defense's requests for leniency. I have weighed the impact of your crimes on the community and the necessity of deterrence. He looked at Mercer. Todd Mercer, for your crimes against the citizens of this country and your assault on federal officers, I sentence you to 18 years in federal prison. You will serve your time at a facility determined by the Bureau of Prisons. You will not be eligible for parole for a minimum of 15 years. Additionally, you will pay restitution to each of your identified victims in an amount to be determined by this court. Mercer swayed on his feet. His attorney reached out to steady him. Furthermore, Pendleton continued, I am recommending to the relevant state authorities that your law enforcement certification be permanently revoked. You will never wear a badge again. You will never carry a weapon in an official capacity. The power you abused has been stripped from you forever. He set down the document. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal Service. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and Todd Mercer, who had spent 12 years believing himself untouchable, was led away in chains to begin the rest of his life in a federal prison. The fallout from the Grayson County case spread far beyond the borders of that single rural Mississippi jurisdiction. Within 6 months of Mercer's conviction, 23 additional indictments had been handed down. Sheriff Michael Rawlings pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Internal Affairs Director Jonathan Hale received 9 years for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. District Attorney Patricia Brennan, who had spent her career protecting corrupt officers, was convicted of multiple federal charges and sentenced to 15 years. Her law license permanently revoked. Deputy Kevin Foley, who had cooperated fully with federal investigators from the moment of his arrest, received probation and a lifetime ban from law enforcement. He testified against his former colleagues, providing crucial evidence about the department's methods and the culture of impunity that had allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. The blue wall of silence had finally cracked, and Foley's testimony drove the wedge deep. The Grayson County Sheriff's Department was dissolved entirely. Its functions were transferred to the state police under a federal consent decree that would last a minimum of 10 years. Every policy was rewritten. Every officer was revetted. The department that emerged bore no resemblance to the criminal enterprise it had replaced. Restitution checks began arriving in mailboxes across the country. 67 victims received compensation for what had been taken from them. Not just the money that had been seized, but damages for the trauma, the humiliation, the years they had spent believing that justice would never come. The amounts varied, but each check carried the same message. You were wronged, and those who wronged you have paid the price. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Marcus Webb drove to Baltimore. It was a route he had driven many times. But today felt different. Today he carried something more than the usual affection and obligation that brought him back to his hometown. Today he carried closure. Keisha's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest building in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying. She buzzed him in without asking who it was. She always knew when he was coming, and was waiting in the doorway when he reached her floor. She was 3 years younger than him, and for most of their childhoods they had been each other's only constant. Different foster homes, different schools, different trajectories, but always connected, always there for each other when everything else fell away. She looked at his face and knew immediately that something had changed. "Is it over?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a newspaper, folded to display the front page. The headline was simple: Grayson County Deputy sentenced to 18 years. Below, it was a photograph of Todd Mercer being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, his face a mask of devastation. Keisha took the newspaper. She stared at the photograph for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at her brother, and her eyes filled with tears. "You did this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I made a promise," Marcus replied. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding on with the desperate grip of someone who had carried pain for too long and was finally allowed to release it. They stood there in the doorway of her apartment, brother and sister, survivors of a system that had failed them in countless ways, sharing a moment of peace that had been 18 months in the making. "Thank you," Keisha whispered against his shoulder. "Always," Marcus replied. He held his sister as she cried, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not triumph, not vengeance satisfied. Something quieter and more important. Justice delivered. Promises kept. The long hard work of accountability finally complete. Some stories end with a dramatic confrontation. A single moment of karma delivered in spectacular fashion. Others end more quietly, with the gradual accumulation of consequences, the slow grinding of institutional wheels until justice finally emerges. The Grayson County case was both. It was a dramatic confrontation on a dark highway, when a corrupt deputy discovered that his latest victim was the very agent sent to destroy him. It was the moment when federal badges appeared and handcuffs clicked, and a reign of terror came to its violent end. But it was also the quiet work that followed. The trials and the testimonies, the restitution and the reforms, the slow methodical dismantling of an organization that had operated as a criminal enterprise for decades, hidden behind the shield of law enforcement authority. Marcus Webb returned to Washington and continued his work with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. There would be other corrupt departments, other predatory officers, other victims crying out for the justice that local systems had denied them. The work was never done. Denise Chambers Webb won commendations for her prosecution of the Grayson County defendants. She was promoted, offered positions of greater responsibility, recognized as one of the Department of Justice's most effective advocates against police corruption, and in a federal prison somewhere in the American heartland. Todd Mercer began serving an 18-year sentence that would consume the rest of his productive life. No union to protect him, no internal affairs to bury complaints, no badge to hide behind, just consequences, finally delivered, for crimes that had seemed for far too long to be without consequence at all. The traffic stop video still circulates online, viewed millions of times by people who need to see that accountability is possible, that the badge does not grant immunity, that even those who abuse their authority will eventually face the justice they denied to others. It has become in its way a symbol, a reminder that power corrupts, but that corruption can be exposed, that the wall of silence can be broken, that the long arc of justice, though slow, does eventually bend toward truth. Keisha Webb keeps the newspaper clipping framed on her wall. Sometimes when the memories of that night on Route 119 threaten to overwhelm her, she looks at the photograph of her tormentor in handcuffs and remembers that her brother kept his promise, that someone somewhere fought for her when no one else would. That justice, though delayed, was never denied. Stories like this remind us that the badge is a sacred trust, not a license for abuse. They remind us that accountability matters, that courage can triumph over corruption, that ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice can change the course of history. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice is worth fighting for, share it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, accountability, and the moments when karma finds its way to those who deserve it. Because the night is dark and the road is long. But justice never stops traveling.